afternoon. Welcome to our show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Well, it's a bizarre phenomenon. People pretending to be Indigenous to get jobs or grants or even just to get attention because it's cool to be us. But what's not funny is that they are taking often highly lucrative work from Indigenous people. They're teaching our histories. They're telling our stories. Today, we're putting identity fraud in focus. I have incredibly smart and fed up guests joining us today. Jacqueline Keeler is a Dene Yankton, Dakota journalist in Portland, Oregon, who's been researching and reporting on this phenomenon that's been going on for decades. She's dedicated a lot of her time and incredible talent to amassing a list of Pretendians, as we know them, taking up space in arts, politics, and academia in the U.S. You're going to love her. As well, Veldon Coburn is an Anishinaabe Algonquin professor who's studied this himself. He's seen it himself, but he says it's a slippery slope to be getting on the identity, or to be policing identities. Also, Tamara Bell, she's a Haida filmmaker. She says enough is enough. These people need to face hefty fines or jail time for profiting off a fake Indigenous identity. All of our guests have lots to say, and we want to give you a say, too, on the topic. You know, we're dedicating our final segment to you. You can call in later in the show with your thoughts. It's toll-free 1-877-647-2786. I'll give you that number again at the back third of this show so you can give us a ring. Before I introduce you to our guests, back in 2018, APTN Investigates reporter John Murray took a look at this phenomenon of white people playing Native in his show, Cowboys and Pretendians. Let's take a look.
Val Kilmer plays an FBI agent who is part Sioux. He's just one example of an actor who plays Indian for a role. Some people also play Indian in real life.
And grateful little brother grew up in the family circle.
The most prominent Pretendian was Archibald Delaney. He called himself Grey Owl and is still considered a cultural treasure by Parks Canada. Iron Eyes Cody is another man who lived his life as a Native American. He even had cameos in popular sitcoms. But guess what? He was Italian. As filmmaker Jeff Barnaby points out, he wasn't the only one.
That's a phenomenon, right? People faking being Native, even outside of like the camera. So I think it's an industry that's kind of ripe for imposters, because there's a need for Native stories out there, but there's not a lot of people that can tell them, particularly behind the camera.
Wenty reminds us that identity policing is a tool of colonialism.
Because identity is such a complicated, painful thing in our communities, and we know why. The government wanted it to be that way. This is what they wanted us. This was actually a goal of colonialism, right? Was to rob us of our ability to define our own nationhoods and our own nations and our own identities.
The director of Canada's Indigenous Screen Office says Pretendians tend to be weeded out by the communities anyway.
In the end, the communities tend to police themselves and sort of figure this out. And when it comes to true people who are truly being fraudulent, they tend to be called out on it.
So since that aired in 2018, there's been no shortage of people taking up space. Most recently, of course, grabbing the biggest headlines was award-winning filmmaker and director Michelle Latimer. She had claimed Métis and Algonquin heritage throughout her career, but she now apologizes for that. Here's a story that Tamara Pimentel did on the fallout from that last month.
It is not an easy time to be Indigenous.
Michelle Latimer gives an acceptance speech in 2018 after Vice Production Rise won a Canadian Screen Award for Best Documentary Program. Over the last week, there have been questions around Latimer's Indigenous identity after a National Film Board media release stated Latimer is of Algonquin, Métis, and French heritage from Kitigan-Zibi in Quebec. Latimer said on Facebook, "I made a mistake in naming Kitigan-Zibi as my family's community before doing the work to formally verify." People in the Indigenous media and entertainment industry have been speaking up. Author and actor Gitz Deranger was a host for Rise and worked closely with Latimer.
For us that have been duped, for us that have bought into that false image that she was portraying, you feel so used. Like, I feel like my my skin color and my ancestral line was weaponized to further her career.
Vladimir has since resigned from the second season of Trickster, and the National Film Board is pulling her documentary Inconvenient Indian from distribution. It won't be playing at the Sundance Film Festival. Vladimir's claim of identity sparked outrage on social media. Heisler novelist Eden Robinson, on whose novel the Trickster series is based, took to Facebook. I feel like such a dupe. I don't know how to deal with the anger, disappointment, and stress. Inuk filmmaker Alethea Arnakak-Baril wrote, Michelle, I call on you to return your Doc Vanguard Award. The Documentary Organization of Canada says Vladimir has agreed to return the award, which was presented to her early December. Drange says Vladimir has robbed other Indigenous talent of opportunities.
We want to see ourselves succeed, people from our nation. And then when this happens, they rob us of that. They just take our stories, and they've always done that. They've always taken our stories. They've always retold our stories. They rob us from these moments.
APTN National News has not been able to reach Vladimir for direct comment, but she has issued public statements taking responsibility for not being clear enough about her heritage. One media outlet is reporting that she has retained legal counsel. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
Joining us now is Jacqueline Keeler. She is Dene Dakota journalist. She's based in Portland, Oregon. She studied and reported on this phenomenon, which maybe if you're like me, it feels like it's a new thing, but no, in fact, it's been going on for generations. She's editor-in-chief of Pollination magazine, among many other hats that she wears. We're so happy to welcome her from Portland.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm glad you could take time. I mean, I had such a great chat with you on this topic. I had said this feels sort of fresh. I don't remember this being a thing when we were growing up, that people would pretend to be Indigenous. In fact, when I was growing up, if anything, you would distance yourself from any aspect of your Indigenous identity. But you shared stories that you remember as a kid, your parents coming back and telling you these stories too, right? Like that somebody was faking it to make it, I guess. What are some of the stories that you remember?
Well, I remember my parents coming back. Both of my parents are Native, and they would come back from dinner parties with colleagues, and they'd say there'd be some new book that had come out. I think like 7 Arrows by, I can't pronounce the name, Hamayas Storm, which came out in 1973. All these books they'd have to answer questions about, and these people were not Native; they were frauds. And certainly we've had these folks have been exposed in, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, even 10 years ago, and people forget. Our communities tend to be kind of siloed, whether it's by, field or by community. Mm-hmm. And so this information is not passed down. And what I found as a journalist interviewing Native folks for years was, particularly Native academics, I would call them and try to get a quote on something completely different. And they would tell me, we have a fraud who's they're going to be my boss pretty soon. But they try to fight it. They try to fight it at the department level. They try, and whole Native organizations, famous Native people like Suzanne Harjo, mm-hmm. and they have called out these frauds. I think Suzanne Harjo called out Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in the 70s. So did Hank Adams. All these folks have fought these frauds, but these frauds persist. There is no accountability, and particularly mm-hmm. because our communities are not in control of academia. We don't own the universities. We don't own the publishing houses. We don't own any of this. It's white people that make the decisions. And so it's they don't really, I do feel also one of the why we're doing the list, and I should say it's an alleged Pretendians list. So we will actually be showing people who actually do have genuine connection as well,
right.
Resolving those questions. And but the issue is that we want to show the pervasiveness of this, because if you look at the list, we're at 158 now, and this list is only people who profit off of it, who hold high status jobs, who are in authority positions in academia, in film and television, you know, in all sorts of places, or people who are positioning, may not be making a lot of money off of it, but are positioning themselves as our leader, as our spokespeople on national, international issues. Yeah. And so these people have to have standing to make these claims. And what we're finding with particularly the professors and the film actors, is that they are claiming descent, but when we look at their family trees, they have no descent. There is no descent. They're making the claim, and they're equivocating their lack of proof to that of someone of genuine descent. Like we actually suggest that when we use the term of descent, that you stipulate the generation. How many generations separate you from a tribally enrolled or an Indigenous person who was raised in a tribal community, a recognized part of a tribal community? You give the number. Is it 1 or is it 6? You know, Anita Lucchesi, who heads up the MIW database here in the United States, she is a 6th-generation descendant. And the Cheyenne woman that she claims, we have no documentation of what family she came from. And their family has lived as white people ever since 1830.
I love this idea of listing the descent, right? Because I think that's kind of a part of the conversation that hasn't been happening when we're talking about how people identify. And then it's like, well, where is the cutoff? Like, you know, your grandma was Indigenous, so is that good enough? Or are we willing to accept that your great grandmother, as is the case in Canada a lot of times, we've got people who proclaim to be Indigenous today based on a root ancestor from the 1600s, right? You know, is that enough? Let's just get it out there and identify like how Indigenous you are, I guess. And I like, I like the idea.
You're talking about 6th generation, you're talking about 1/64th. And so you're talking about a generation in which you had 64 ancestors, 63 of whom were European, right? One of whom was Native. And then your family goes and lives in a colonial European society. You know, you actually are part of the like Anita Lucchesi, her family actually were county officials which oversaw laws that enslaved Native Californians. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. During the gold rush. And so this is there's a complicity in what they're doing, and also the fact that they enjoyed white privilege legally at a period in time when it was very dangerous to be Native, and they didn't have to endure what our community has endured. And they cannot even point to many of them. I mean, almost every academic we checked has no documented Native ancestry. They have none.
Why do you think it's so common? Like, it's on both sides of the border. It's the field of arts and it's the field of academia that draw these people to fake Indigenous claims. Why these two fields in particular?
Well, with academia, we did document a movement around the early 90s where actual enrolled Native professors were trying to create guidelines, but they were stopped cold by Pretendians. And these folks are in almost every Native department. They're running the departments. So they act collectively to protect their interests. And we also include their publications so people can see how they're driving the discourse on Native identity to suit themselves and their needs. And also in universities here in the United States, under equal employment laws, they are not allowed to ask for proof of Native identity. So it's an open field for grift, and white folks have been, you know, taking advantage of it.
You had said something that really stuck with me, that describing white people performing our identity. Can you explain that, and why does it work so well for them?
Yeah, well, my cousin Phil Deloria, he wrote a book called Playing Indian, in which he documented the historical sort of use of playing Indian. Here in the States, you know, of course, they dressed up like Mohawks when they did the Tea Party and threw the tea into the, you know, starting the Revolutionary War. But it's persisted, and it is even more. It really is another form of Karening, almost, I would say. And I think that white people are so accustomed, they're centered by white supremacy to such an extent that they feel no compunction about doing this. And I think that there's a level maybe even which they covet what we have, and they feel we don't deserve it. And so they decide they can perform the identity better than we can, and they can for a white audience. White people there was a study done in 2017 by Reclaiming Native Truth, and what they found was in these focus groups that white people, first of all, 30% think they are of Native descent. That's 50 million people in the United States. Right. Yeah. How many are going to check the box? How many are going to, you know, go full, you know, live action role play? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so we have a sitting senator who did that, Elizabeth Warren. Right. Right. And Harvard tried her out when they had accusations of lack of representation of women of color at Harvard in the 1990s. You know, And so it's I think that white people like to see, what they found was white people like to see other white people in red face. It makes them feel really good. It reinforces their in-group cohesion. It raises their self-esteem. So we're fighting something in which, and they also found that only 30% of white people understood the mascot issue, which is I think on the spectrum of this performance of ethnicity.
Yeah. We had somebody on Twitter, Johnny Hawk on Twitter, said something. I wanted to get your take on this. It's ironic that political correctness outlawed questioning those with questionable identity who come in our circles, which only helped to create this issue. And now the same cancel culture wants to make it a requirement to question those with questionable identities in our circles. I mean, just kind of, what's your, I thought of that. I'm like, well, this is why I'm perpetually confused and feeling like I'm living in a snow globe, is because of those layers of confusion.
Well, it's purposeful. I mean, they want to use real issues in our communities to benefit themselves. These are not non-issues. But why we're doing a study, a comprehensive study, we're going to do a 30-year study of hiring practices in academia here in the United States, and we want to see the pervasiveness of it. We want to track, and what we're finding now is the majority of hires in Native Studies departments preference people who have no claim, who have no proof, right? They're getting all the jobs. And is that demographically an accurate representation of us? Can most Native people not prove that they are Native? Is that the norm? Or is this demonstrating bias? And certainly white people and white women in particular have benefited the most from the civil rights movement here in the United States. And so there is always the issue of white supremacy, of white privilege that is brought into any of these different things. And I should say that anyone who is enrolled, right, has had to prove things. This is inherent in who we are. We've had to prove. And if a professor was hired thinking that they were Sri Lankan and they were hired to cover Southeast Asian studies or work directly with and counsel Southeast Asian students, and then you found out they were actually they were English people from Great Britain pretending to be Sri Lankan, wouldn't that call into question a lot of their scholarship, their state of mind, everything? And I think that it's our lack of the outlines of our political reality have been made purposely fuzzy through the interest of colonial governments, right? And because they want claims to our land. It's our political reality that is the most threatening reality we possess. And this is why our identity is so assumable. It's, any colonized people, everything is up for grabs. Their language, their children, everything can be taken from them. And this is just part of the colonial process. And so we should create ways, I have a whole, I do this podcast for Pollination Magazine, and I have a whole podcast about structural fixes for Pretendianism. And what I actually propose is a federal Indigenous government through which we recognize each other, and also then and strengthen our political reality.
We have to take a quick caller here, and then we got to go to a break. We have Gitz from Calgary on the line.
Hello, hello.
Hey, we just saw you in a story that we ran from last month.
Wow, that's cool.
And now you're here with us in real life, real time.
I'm totally loving the conversation you're having right now. I just want to quickly point out that settlers, white people, really only look at our blood and color. They don't really look much deeper than that. And for Indigenous identity, color and blood tells me what you are, doesn't tell me who you are. And it's our kinship connection to our culture, our history, our communities that really define who we are, and they're so diverse between communities. The other thing I really wanted to touch on too was that there's a whole spectrum of these pretenders. I call them cultural LARPers or cultural cosplayers. Cultural cosplayer is like a cosplayer who just dresses up, like that lady from, I think it's Yellowstone, that Asian lady who said she was Native. That's it. It's just something that she's putting on to get a part. Whereas you have people like Michelle Latimer and Joseph Boyden who fully immerse themselves, and it becomes this like LARP adventure, which is live action role playing. Those dudes and people who dress up like Lord of the Rings, then they go fight in a field.
Like the Civil War reenactors type.
Yeah,
thing,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
These people are cultural LARPers, and it's like they're like Joseph Boyden's whole career has been one big cultural LARPing experience. Like he's just putting on this stuff and pretending, and that's all he really is. But they get so far into it, and then they get exposed, and it becomes really, I don't know what's more sad or tragic or pitiful or dumb. I don't know.
I don't know. Back to you, Jacqueline, just quickly here. So what, where can people follow the work that you're doing on this? Where's the best place to kind of, is it Twitter?
Yeah, I'm at JF Keeler, and then also I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, Jacqueline Keeler, and then we're going to be publishing this in Pollination Magazine, and the list is accessible to people who are legitimately interested in helping with the research. And but I also have a term that I came up with called ethnic mimicry, and it's but I think that what they take advantage of, and most of these folks are white presenting, is the fact that we have diverse families, and two people can look equally white, but one have a legitimate Native descent, and the other one be completely fraudulent. And so it's they and here in the United States, tribes, they set their own terms of enrollment, and so it's a form of sovereignty to determine who are our citizens. And we may disagree with a particular tribal nation's decisions, but it is really up to the tribe themselves to make those changes.
Totally. Well, we thank you for taking the time to join us today, Jacqueline. You can find her on Twitter, follow her work. We have to take a quick break. When we come back, how pervasive is this in the hallowed halls of academia? We just spoke about that a little bit. What's being done to stop it? We're going to talk to Veldon Coburn. He's joining us. And hi to filmmaker and First Talk host Tamara Bell. She says people need to be fined or go to jail if they're faking their identity. She'll tell you why when we come back.
Why do people not care about our Indigenous economies? Shouldn't we care? We should care. We make our living from this. So when people are taking our jobs and taking up space, they're actually taking food off of our plate. And
join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back. We had a lot of comments and discussion on our social media about identity fraudsters. Let's go to our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear some of your thoughts.
Thanks, Melissa. Online, we wanted to know your thoughts on Indigenous identity fraudsters. We've received hundreds of comments. Let's take a look. First, from Tracy Lynn. People need to just call them out, not worry about being kind about it. Call it what it is. Vaughn commented, identity politics is cancel culture. Identity politics is neo-colonialism. Academics and filmmakers, both wannabe gatekeepers, do not speak for the people, thank goodness. Joshua said, my view is these folks who are not Indigenous claiming to be us are only taking up space and making it tougher for those disconnected to find their way back to their respective nations. From Betty, I have witnessed white people claiming Indigenous identity in a federal government workplace. These fraudsters not only get hired, but promoted successively. They then snub and look down their noses at real Indigenous people that they're supposed to represent. Stephanie said, fines for sure. It's getting ridiculous these days. Cultural appropriation to the max with pretenders. Lastly, from Kat, I'm working to find a path back to my Cree culture, and the onus is on me to learn my language. I have been confronted by so many different versions of cultural people that it's become ridiculous. Even people from my community telling me I don't look like anyone from the community. Thank you to all of our commenters. If you want to share your thoughts on Indigenous identity fraud, here's how.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
A Haida filmmaker and the host of First Talk, which airs here on APTN, is calling for the creation of an Indigenous Identification Act. Tamara Bell says that it would hopefully deter fraudsters and impersonators from taking on the identity of Indigenous people to get jobs or to get grant monies. She joined me on APTN National News last week to explain how it would work. So, Tamara, the act that you're proposing is similar to what exists already in the United States, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. Can you give us a little bit of the gist of what that is and what's required for authentication?
Well, the authentication is handled by each sovereign nation. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of, well, how are you going to authenticate people? But it's actually authenticated already by the government. So you've got your sovereign nations who authenticate you, and then you've also got the government involved. So people think that we're going to intervene. We're not intervening. Those methods already exist. This is simply an act to say that if you are fraudulently saying that you're Indigenous, that you could possibly be criminally have charges pressed against you, $250,000 fine or a 5-year prison term. Some people say there shouldn't be a prison term, but if an act doesn't have teeth, people are not going to act accordingly. So if you look at, like, say, for example, in Canada, if we have jobs and money and a whole bunch of people from other countries taking high-level positions, there's laws in place to prevent, say, a whole bunch of German people coming over and then taking up tons of positions that are meant for Canadians without being authenticated. So those things are already in place. So I'm not proposing that. I'm proposing consequences to actions.
Love it. And now, you've said that this is widespread in the arts and film industry, whereby non-Indigenous people suddenly discover some old Indigenous root and then go to access funding that's meant for Indigenous creators. You know, who are you looking? Is it just the arts world that should enshrine this act, or do you want to see it more broadly applied, like to, you know, politics, jobs, that sort of thing?
Well, it needs to be broadly applied. When you look at that, academia. It's infiltrated academia. It's infiltrated. So say, for example, in my sister's law school, I mean, when she was going to UBC and studying law, I'd say 30% of the people in her university were not Indigenous, but they claimed Indigenous identity. So those high-level jobs, if they enter into a job and self-declare themselves as Indigenous, we actually are not protecting our economies. So we have an Indigenous economy that we're trying to protect. So when we lost the Keystone Pipeline in Canada, Trudeau immediately jumped in and said, we're not going to lose revenue, we're not going to lose jobs. But why is it okay for Indigenous people to lose jobs? And why is it okay for us to not have control over who declares and who doesn't declare Indigenous ancestry without validating evidence? You know, there's a lot of charlatans out there, and it's a common term called Pretendians, which is people assuming Indigenous identity when they're not, because it's profitable for their career or it's profitable for, you know, their pocketbook. And I think, you know, when you look at it in jobs and statistics and information, when you look at, like, the amount of revenue that is being lost because we're not feeding our Indigenous economy, we're actually not feeding people, literally. And when you talk about the arts, it's an incredibly painful. I've read all of the stories about how the arts have been infiltrated, and it literally broke my heart. And there's an underbelly to this story. Once a charlatan is revealed, there's a playbook. So this didn't get covered in anything, but I want to say it because there was a number of elders who supported this act, and they were all from across the country. And what happens is that the playbook says, you get found out that you're not Indigenous, you do a DNA test, and once the DNA test comes back that you might have a sliver of, like, Indigenous ancestry, and then the next thing is to go to our elders. Now, so there's elders who are being called, solicited, you know, they've already gone through enough. And so they don't sometimes have social media, they're not on the internet, and they're actually being targeted to validate the fraudulent career of a person who's claiming Indigenous ancestry. So I think that there's many layers to this story. I know people are very upset about the bill and what I've proposed, and I'm sorry if people are deeply upset and very angry at me. Really, the intent is to protect our artists, our elders, our academia, our people, and not attack, you know, I mean, I'm there, but please don't attack the elders, and especially on social media, because that's 100% inappropriate.
So what's the next step for this act to take effect? What has to happen?
Well, the next act is presented to senators. So I've already sent things out to 2 senators. I'm in the process of sending something out to another senator. So it's going to go to the Senate, and then there's going to be the legislation drafted, and it's very similar to an existing legislation in the United States. So it's not revolutionary. the only reason I came out and I decided to say something is that I saw how badly traumatized our community was. And when you look at the ongoing theft, it's almost like they stole one of the most precious amulets we've ever had that's been our possession for thousands of years. And then they go to the people that they stole it from and said, now can you protect my career after I stole this from you? And so this is the injustice. And so I'm here because I don't want elders to be targeted. I'm here because I think that we have a bright moment here where we can define in this seminal moment who we are as Indigenous people, who owns the culture, who gives us the right to tell our stories, who gives us the right to protect our jobs, who allows us, why do people not care about our Indigenous economies? Shouldn't we care? We should care. We make our living from this. So when people are taking our jobs and taking up space, they're actually taking food off of our plate. And I've been hungry. I know what it's like. And it's horrible and it's terrible. And for people to just come in and take Indigenous identity, they really cheapen our trauma, our genocide, our history. And it makes me incredibly sad. I was heartbroken. And I still am. I'm still heartbroken. But I think that as Indigenous people, we're strong, we're compassionate, we're resilient. We've got Indigenous intelligentsia that are amazing, who are going to figure out this situation. And I am so grateful that we have those academics there who are going to move things forward and move the dialogue forward and protect us, protect our Indigenous economies.
I love this. Tamara, I don't think you need to apologize for anything that you'd said. Sorry that people are angry. That's their problem. I thank you for taking time to join us today and share this with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really, thank you very much for your time.
As we discussed earlier with Jacqueline Keeler before the break, Pretendians are rampant in post-secondary institutions, teaching our histories from the comfort of their whiteness. Well, Veldin Coburn is an Anishinaabe, Algonquin Canadian and Indigenous Studies professor at the University of Ottawa. He joins us now to talk about exactly that. Hi, Veldin.
Hi, Melissa.
I'm glad you could join us. I wanted to say, though, I hear, people like Tamara, who we just heard, it's like they need to be hauled out, these people, they need to be fined, they should go to jail. And I'm like, yes, maybe this is the fix. And then very highly intelligent people like you going, whoa, 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 pump the brakes. That's not the answer. How come?
I think it's a little bit excessive in terms of the punitive measures that they want to impose, lifting from, say, the United States and their legislation. I don't know if that's actually a model we want to emulate. I have a little bit more generosity and reconciliatory kind of inclinations towards those who might be guilty of being Pretendians. I just think that prison is particularly draconian and disproportionately cruel to what is otherwise a social sin, and what they do. And
but like Jacqueline and Tamara are saying, I mean, these people are taking a lot of money off of our kitchen tables, right, by doing this. And so, is it too heavy-handed to say, if you're going to do that, just know ahead of time the repercussions? I mean, I see what you're saying with the when people do this to try to be, a little more forgiving and to approach it a little more light-handedly than throwing people in jail and fining them $250,000. I mean, I get that, but I'm just looking at, like, if there was this as a deterrent, maybe we wouldn't have to then be dealing with so many of the people who are just making these false claims, or is oftentimes the case in Canada. I have a relative from the 1600s who may or may not have been Mi'kmaq or Algonquin. We see that a lot too. You're just totally opposed to the idea of that being a potential penalty for making those claims.
Well, I sympathize with the frustration. It is really deeply offensive in a lot of ways for what they do, especially in certain industries where they do make their money and livelihood by, I guess, crowding out legitimate Indigenous people through fraud and deceit. I don't know how rampant it is to say, well, 5 years in prison plus $250,000, what might have been proposed in the legislation that Ms. Bell has put forward is is proportionate. I understand the sting that people respond to when they lose out on a job to somebody who checks the box and says, I'm Indigenous, and they probably don't have any Indigenous connection whatsoever. I do see it quite a bit in academia as well, more than I'd like to, and they get propped up by the institutions too, so there's a little bit more blame to be spread around than just to prop it on the shoulders. It seems de rigueur today, like very fashionable for some people who would never have claimed to be Indigenous before. Like, they don't want to go to our reserves and our communities to drink the water because they'd rather the accolades and, I guess, whatever sort of financial benefits they can gain themselves by claiming this. For me, just looking upon it, it's a bit of a parody to see the sort of inane and ridiculous, almost ignorant parade of Pretendians come out. Like, it's a personality type for me of who adopts this, and why do other people, clamor or at least gather around these people and prop them up to pretend what is authentic when it's otherwise just a deceit.
I'm going to ask you why it's so prevalent in academia too, but we have a caller here we want to go to quickly. Erin, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm on the line.
Hey,
Can you hear
Erin,
me?
what did you want to add to the conversation?
Oh, thank you. So I'm a Mi'kmaq master's student here in Nova Scotia, and so I'm doing my master's in Indigenous health research. And through my research and my community work, I've been hearing a lot of frustration with how data is collected, specifically frustrations with Statistics Canada, in that they mainly rely on self-identification. One example here in Atlantic Canada is that the self-identifying Indigenous population doubled in the last Statistics Canada census. Right. And there's a lot of questions around the validity of this data and whether or not this increase is a result of people claiming indigeneity who have real no claim. So my question is, in general, what is the implication of this particular issue on Indigenous-based data? I'm thinking specifically health data, but also other forms of data, employment, housing, etc.
Thank you for that. Belgian?
Yes, I've actually studied this myself and looked at post-secondary education completion rates, and the extraordinarily huge bump in completion rates that occurred in 2011 on the East Coast for self-identified Mi'kmaq individuals. I had wondered when I was looking at it, what happened between 2006 and 2011, and then again to 2016? Why did Indigenous people close the post-secondary education gap? And it happened to be because everyone was self-identifying in 2011 in the census because of the establishment of the Halapu landless Mi'kmaq community. Over 100,000 people all of a sudden became Indigenous overnight, and it was quite a mess at INAC because I was there at the time, and all this leads to very distorted statistics which undermine the effectiveness of public policy that targets, say, health inequities and education outcomes. So, for instance, you might start believing now in the East Coast that there is no gap between outcomes in education, that all of a sudden Indigenous people down on the East Coast are on equal terms. But again, it's a lot of white, non-Indigenous people who are now claiming to be Indigenous, who never had to face sort of the disadvantages and discrimination of being Indigenous and all the barriers that was to completion. So you would see that also likely play out in, say, health statistics and other socioeconomic outcomes that Erin was alluding to here. So it's a deep statistical distortion of the overall picture, and it's unhelpful because then governments stop providing targeted programming to those who actually need it.
Absolutely. So it's destructive in that regard, and then it's also destructive in that it's taking money off of Indigenous tables. With these people taking up space, taking up these jobs, but you're still saying we can't throw them in jail or fine them. What do we do? Like, there's got to be something that puts a stop to it. Like, it's so destructive.
Yeah, I agree. There is some damage that we incur because of these wayward sort of personality types, and at the aggregate level, certainly. I think because we do end up probably in my sector in academia is we do figure out who they are. We ferret them out, and we find out that, well, they were hired on fraudulent basis, that they convinced the people that hired them that they were Indigenous, and they never really were. And then later on, when they're getting grants and getting other sort of accolades and public adulation, that they start to withdraw because, and not all of them, because some double down, but and really harden their stance. But for others, when they get found out, say, like, even in the arts community, like the Michelle Latimers of the world, is there sort of a corrective adjustment effect here? Is that they're not going to be taking any more? And what sort of benefit to us would it be to throw someone into prison? And I'm cognizant, though, say, for example, of the extreme incarceration rates of Indigenous people, both Indigenous men and women, especially on the prairies, that, well, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where we make up 15 to 20% of the population, yet 80% of the prison population. We Indigenous people know what it does to destroy an individual by imprisoning them.
Yeah. So if not actual jail, what about this? If you want to pretend that if you want to make up a fake claim and take up a job of an Indigenous person, then instead of jail, we make you go live on a res. You want to claim that? You have to go, and it has to be one of the ones that has a boil water advisory. It's got to be remote. It's got to have overcrowding.
Yeah, I mean, that gets back to the sort of authentic lifestyle. If you want to put on the feathers and show up at a board meeting and have everyone think that you are the voice for Indigenous people, yeah, I mean, if you want to embrace some sort of parodying of authenticity, then go and live like us. But I mean, some of this thing too, it just makes us look stupid because we don't all live like that, from the urban Indigenous person to, yeah.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Veldon, to talk about this. We have a quick call and then we got to go to a break. Will from Ottawa, what did you have to say? Quick.
Well, I think that you guys brought up some valid points, that it takes away the legitimacy of those of us that have been struggling not only to find our identity, but to be able to live in our identity. There's groups, for instance, like Asman, the Algonquin Solutrean Métis Indigenous Nation, that are claiming to be Indigenous. What the heck is a Solutrean? The whole Solutrean thing has been disproven. And yet, they want, all these people want the benefits of being Native without having to go through the struggle that we went through.
Reality.
To be where we are even today, even through the continued genocide of the Canadian government and all that.
Yeah. We got to go to a quick break here, though. I'm going to have to cut you off. Sorry, we've run out of time here. But we are going to take more callers after the break, so stay with us. Last week, we dove into the wonderful world of Native TikTok and the incredibly talented people that are creating content on that platform. Well, identity imposters have not gone unnoticed on that app. We have to share this one because it's appropriate, and it's hashtagged Pretendian. It's by Charlie Flight, an actress of Lakota, Haudenosaunee, and European descent. Let's watch.
Nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. They're gonna know. How would they know? How would they know? How would they know? I can't. I can't. Oh my God.
We have another call. We have a bunch of callers, actually. Damon, I believe, is on the line. Damon, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
From Saskatchewan. So you had an interesting perspective on this, saying that the whole conversation is toxic, this whole conversation we're having today. Explain.
Yeah, I think that it devolves into a form of identity politics that isn't necessarily helpful, and it can turn into a conversation where you have people who are being harassed and intimidated and bullied because they don't look like their First Nations, but they might have First Nations ancestry. And I saw it in the comments earlier this week, and I thought it was quite troubling.
I guess, and I see that too. And so, I mean, lots of people say like, well, what are you? You don't look First Nation. I'm not First Nation. I'm Métis on my dad's side and Polish and English on my mom's side. And usually when you explain that, people go, okay, well, that's fine. But isn't it like, shouldn't we be having these conversations? Shouldn't it be okay to be like, well, what are you? Where are you from? Who's your family? And then if you don't have an actual claim to an Indigenous identity, should you be, you're taking jobs, you're taking grant money, you're in positions of power, you're forming policy that affects Indigenous people. I mean, I get that there's the bullying aspect of it, but look at all the cons on the other side of it. Like, does it I don't know. I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but
yeah,
don't you see like the harm that it causes? Isn't it so much that it's worth having the conversations?
Certainly, it's worth having the conversation. Definitely, it's just my fear is when the conversation goes to the point of that level of harassment, and I don't want to discount that there's the people who do make fraudulent claims. Mm-hmm. But you also have to take into account that Canada is a very multicultural society, and that there's a lot of people who come from mixed backgrounds who they might not have had the strong claims to their families in the past, but they recently just found out about Indigenous ancestry that they have. Yeah. There's a lot of people who are in that boat who they don't have that strong connection. So it's.
I get it. I mean, I get your point, and I thank you for joining us on the phone here today to make that point. I mean, I see it. I do see it. We also have Betty on the line from Saskatchewan.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
Hey, I'm great, Betty. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
So, I mean, you have seen this. This isn't a new. I mean, it's in the news now because of Michelle Latimer, but this is not new to you. You've witnessed this at work, right?
Oh, yes. I worked in a federal government workplace where I witnessed people identifying themselves as Indigenous just to get hired and then to get promoted. And because they checked the box, they are promoted successively. But at the same time, they have no physical resemblance to an Indigenous person. They don't have the background. And in my opinion, the strongest disadvantage that an Indigenous person faces is our physical appearance and how Native we look.
No, that's for sure. I mean, as somebody who I don't get stared at walking down the street. I don't know that lived experience is not mine. Nobody looks at me and judges me based on that girl. Right?
Oh yeah, it's very, very real. The hate is real.
For sure.
I think because of the abuse of affirmative action, and these fraudsters should actually face some very serious consequences. Like, I don't believe in jail, but I do believe in very stiff fines. And the vetting process to get real Indigenous people in those positions.
Right. But are you saying there has to be people who, like, I mean, I guess it's two different things. Being Indigenous but not looking Indigenous, and then being Indigenous and looking Indigenous. You're okay with people who are authentically, legitimately Indigenous taking these jobs, even if they're light-skinned people?
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. So I think right here we have to distinguish between being Indigenous and having Indigenous ancestry. A person that is legitimately Indigenous, like a person from a First Nations like I am, or from a Métis settlement, and are very visibly Indigenous, are very disadvantaged. And this is why Section 15.2 of the Charter was created, to ameliorate or fix and improve the conditions that people like me face.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes along that is not visibly Native, and I don't have a problem. Let's just say that with somebody taking space because they are Indigenous, and I include in this People that have Indigenous ancestry, though, they face less disadvantage than somebody who is like very visibly Indigenous.
Absolutely.
I think this is a conversation we should be having, and there should be fines for fraudsters within the system who are taking advantage.
Yeah. Well, like I said to Veldon, maybe, you know, if you want to pretend that you're Indigenous, or you want to pretend you've got some First Nations ancestor from hundreds of years ago, and that makes you Indigenous today, then maybe the fine, and if it's wrong, then maybe the fine should be you have to go and live that reality on a reserve. Thanks for talking to us, Betty. We have to go now to... You take care. As Jacqueline Keeler had points out, many imposters continue to make money from the work even after they're outed for identity fraud. APTN broke a story in 2016, of course, when questions began to surround author Joseph Boyden's Indigenous background and where and how he acquired some of his stories. Well, in case you're wondering what he's up to since then, he packed up and headed down to the States. A post for a creative writing class by Boyden are currently being offered using his award-winning work that he did while he was pretending to be Indigenous. We are all out of time. Thanks for joining our conversation today. Always great to talk about identity. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you back here next week with some Indigenous reads that you will want on your bedside table. Take care.